Good evening. Welcome to this UFM Lou Douglas lecture. I'm Linda Tiener, the Executive Director at UFM Community Learning Center. My job is to tell you a little bit about the origins of our lecture series and then to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker. Our lecture series is named after Lou Douglas, who was a professor in political science from 1949 to 1977. Lou was a terrific guy, very much beloved by his students, by other faculty, and by the community. His focus was very much on grassroots organizing and social justice issues. Even now, many years later, I hear stories about Lou and run into students of Lou's that talk with great respect for the things that he did. Lou was also one of the first board members and the first president of the UFM board and did many useful and helpful things as UFM was started almost 50 years ago. And so we developed the lecture series in 1979 as a way to honor Lou and to continue the conversations around social justice and grassroots organizing. Our speaker tonight is going to continue that tradition. And I wanted to let you know that this lecture is underwritten by K-State Student Governing Association, and we thank them, as well as support from the English Department's Cultural Studies Department. At this time, I want to introduce Dr. Don Hedrick, who is in the English Department, who's going to introduce our speaker. Don?
Thank you, Linda. I guess I'm the middle manager here for every place needs a middle manager. I'm really delighted that everybody could be here on this extremely cold night to hear my friend Marc Bousquet, and especially the tradition that Linda talked about of Lou Douglas favoring the whole spirit and inquiry into social justice is especially important, I think, for this lecture today. We often think of social justice elsewhere. That is, I think it's Dickens talked about telescopic philanthropy, where we look for things to help and to do good at that are distant from us. But sometimes we forget the needs for social justice at home and even more locally at the university. And this is where Marc Bousquet enters the scene as a participant in a growing academic inquiry called critical university studies sometimes. Marc is an associate professor of English at Emory University. He founded Workplace, the Journal of Academic Labor, is co-editor of The Politics of Information, Electronic Mediation of Social Change, and co-editor of Tenured Bosses and Disposable Teachers in 2004. His recent work is How the University Works. You will see copies of this on the tables outside the Forum Hall, and they are available for $26, including tax. So that's my gesture to the marketplace here. Pardon? Marc will also sign them for a small additional fee. It's a really fascinating book. The chapters in it and the information in it. It sometimes tells the horror stories of labor that we can fear as not in the past, of child labor of the 19th century, but student labor of the 21st and maybe even on further. From Ritalin to budgeting sports stadiums, the inequalities of the nation are reflected in the university. And with compulsory competition of public schools, programs, and university themselves, as well as the issues of discounted or even free labor and internships, and even what was fascinating to me is read about internships that one pays for. And you can go online, I guess it is, and find a place called Dream University, where you can pay a few $1,000s and have an internship. One of the shockers for me was to see the change from when I was at the university a long time ago, when he, as Marc points out, in 1970, the minimum wage, working at the minimum wage would require you to work about 22 hours a week to be able to afford the tuition at a public university. That is now at 55 hours per week. So there's been a huge change in the cost of university education and the inequality of being able to afford it. Marc's writing he's a fine writer. His titles are sometimes sensational, pleasantly. In my classes, we read We Are All Roman Porn Stars Now, about providing free creative labor, or Shut Up and Take Your Ritalin, Robots Are Grading Your Papers, and something that might not be as happy for universities complaining about administrative salaries. A talk, Asking Whether College Presidents Are Overpaid is the Wrong Question. His current project is reflected in the title today, Monetizing the Students. And without being too much more of a middle manager, let me introduce Marc Bousquet. Welcome into K-State.
I really want to thank Don and Linda for this opportunity, and it's a real honor to be asked to be part of the tradition of these lectures. There's nothing more important than what this organization stands for. I also want to apologize in advance to the 12 or 14 of you who have been under Don's sway and have been compelled to read endless quantities of my output. You will recognize as many as three or 4 minute sections that I've adapted for introductory purposes tonight, and I apologize to the 12 of you for that. Okay, so in April 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated while organizing mass protests in support of an illegal strike by Memphis sanitation workers. Like many activists of his day, he saw a profound intersectionality between discrimination by race or sex and workplace exploitation. He asked, what does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't earn enough money to buy a hamburger and a cup of coffee? In response to intersecting modes of oppression, King and others believe that almost inevitably, most liberatory social movements pursued at least some shared goals. Calling the struggle for economic equality a new era for the civil rights movement, King believed that the shared experiences of workplace oppression prepared the way for mass solidarity. In doing so, he belonged to a broad, activist, intellectual tradition. The long tradition of intersectional labor analysis includes the oratory of Frederick Douglass, the sociology of W.E.B. Du Bois, the feminist anarchism of Lucy Parsons and Emma Goldman, the revolutionary communist poetry of Langston Hughes and Amiri Baraka, among countless others. The intersectional view is in significant tension with common uses of the term labor to indicate a distinct or special interest group. In mainstream journalism and school curricula, the term most commonly refers to organized labor, especially politically influential trade union membership. For many, this narrow mainstream usage calls up images of sweat and industrial grime, especially the meatpackers, miners, and auto workers in films like Paul Schrader's Blue Collar from 1980 or Barbara Koppel's Oscar-winning documentaries in 1976 and 1991. This usage obscures a very different, far more diverse reality. At present, the most unionized U.S. occupations are education and civil service, about 40%, as compared to 10% of miners and factory workers. If image reflected reality, our notion of a typical union member might be 50-ish female, an Inuit teacher, a Korean-American corrections officer, or a Puerto Rican clerk at the DMV. The gulf between simplistic media imagery and diverse reality raises critical questions regarding the tendency to stereotype labor as chiefly white and male, blue collar, a group characterized by a culture of rough, manly, almost effortless solidarity. In fact, the overwhelming majority of American labor is non-union. Today, 88% of wage workers in the regulated formal economy do not bargain collectively, often because worker-hostile laws deny basic protections from employer retaliation. And I think we can expect it's a trend that will continue. The height of union density in the United States, about 1950, was a lifetime ago. Even at that peak, only 1 in 3 American workers were represented by unions. From this perspective, the study of workers who bargain collectively is the study of a steadily shrinking workplace minority. In fact, many observers argue that some contemporary union members represent a labor aristocracy, a small, unusually privileged sector of the workforce whose experiences are unrepresentative of the norm. This talk is extracted from a book in progress that forms a sequel to the earlier book that Don promoted so vigorously to you, most of which you can experience free online. There's no reason to spend $26 for the book. There's one chapter you can't buy. So it forms a sequel to this book that explored campus organization and management, particularly from the standpoint of graduate students and the faculty considered as workers. Let's see. One chapter, the last written, this chapter, but probably the most widely read, addressed undergraduate labor. That became the starting point for this new project called Monetizing the Student, which goes beyond the question of wage labor to the much larger universe of ways students create value in what you might call the campus economic complex, even when they aren't working at all. The sort of central nugget of this piece addresses student value creation in essentially all of the variations in online pedagogy at scale, whether you're talking about CMOOCs, XMOOCs, SPOCs, or DOCs. I'll focus some of the second part of the talk on this niche angle of the role of students in generating value in massive courses, and I'll spend the first part setting up the frame of reference. So in the Students Are Already Workers chapter, I explored the role of an incredibly powerful four-way partnership between UPS, the University of Louisville, the state of Kentucky, and the Teamsters Union. Working together behind a phalanx of public relations specialists, these four entities agreed to the formation of something called the Metropolitan College, which isn't a college at all, but a course credit factory that promises students a University of Louisville degree, tuition remission, and loan forgiveness, so long as they don't quit their student financial aid job at UPS's Louisville World Port. If you've been following the for-profit scandals, this should sound familiar. The partnership sends teams of recruiters deep into Appalachia looking for credulous students with poor guidance and hapless families, collecting signatures on no-quit labor contracts that make students liable for the full year's loans and tuition at sticker price if they leave UPS before the year is out. The chapter details how miserable the work is, how many students want to quit, and find out too late that they can't. With absolutely no oversight, Metropolitan College slapped together some classrooms right on the tarmac with courses beginning promptly after shift at 3 a.m., right beneath the every 2-minute thunder of jets bearing cargo that the students had just sorted and loaded. When I interviewed Metropolitan College administrators some years ago now, it had stats worse than many for-profit schools or MOOCs, with the majority of registered students in school but not enrolled in any classes at all. They were simply showing up to work so as not to get stuck with a big bill for their unused tuition. Nonetheless, you couldn't find a press report that had anything but glowing accounts of the philanthropic victory of all parties involved in providing what they called access to higher ed to students who they claimed wouldn't otherwise have had it. Here's the schedule that recipients of this largesse worked every weekend of the school year. Every Monday night, every Tuesday night, every night except weekends. A 3-hour shift from midnight to 3 a.m. at a Teamster negotiated rate of $8 an hour. That means every school night about 5 hours of sleep beginning about 6 a.m. and a class schedule limited to afternoons and weekends, all for $24 a day. A unionized adult loader would have been paid at least $24 an hour and wouldn't have agreed to drive to work for just 3 hours in the middle of the night when public transportation doesn't even run. And UPS would have had to pay for more expensive benefits than discounted tuition at U of L. Rather than philanthropy, the real reasons for this partnership between government, campus, corporation, and union are pretty clear. Even the Teamsters made out like bandits. By bargaining such a rotten deal for the students and part-timers, they were able to maintain the high wages and other privileges of the drivers, whom remain among the US labor aristocracy, though now pretty sleazily at the expense, and pretty openly, at the expense of the next generation of workers. As you can see, when I interviewed them in 2007, Metropolitan College proudly claimed over 10 years to have assisted 10,000 people with its scholarship and loan forgiveness program. They were really psyched about the spike in part-time worker retention. As a result, none of the students are quitting, they told me. They must be really dedicated. They have a great work ethic. But when I asked them to account for the degrees earned by the same 10,000, this is all they could come up with after considerable delay and pestering. 111 associate's degrees and 181 bachelor's, a degree rate of 3%. Today, these arrangements have been reproduced by delivery companies at nearly all major sorting hubs and by massive online vendors such as Amazon. If you're going to talk about value in higher education, you're going to have to ask, in what sense is higher education productive? And where does that productivity come from? That productivity is surely social in the sense of producing intangibly better citizens and numerous tangible services, but it is also straightforwardly economic and relatively easy to measure. Goldman Sachs infamously spent $3.4 billion, much of it borrowed, to buy EDMC, the Education Management Corporation, at a time when EDMC served fewer than 80,000 students, paying roughly $45,000 an enrolled head. Everybody on Wall Street loved the gamble at the time, but with massive debt and eye-popping executive compensation, which you see here, that's right, if you're going to go into higher ed administration, do it in the for-profits. Most of the funding came from Pell Grants, veterans benefits, and other public expenditures, almost 90%. They experienced diminishing returns on more and more aggressive recruiting schemes, ultimately hiring one full-time recruiter for every 28 students. That's 8 working days per student enrolled in the school. Considering their enrollment rate, that's about their graduation rate, that's about 2 or 3 students per recruiter, 2 or 3 graduates per recruiter. And the recruiters made $45,000 or $50,000 a year. So with profit remaining flat at about $2,400 a worker, EDMC ultimately attracted regulatory attention. That was the Harkin panel. And lawsuits for its recruiting scandals, and is currently trading at pennies on the dollar. However, I think they're recovering after Obama backed off the regulation just 2 days ago. But for our purposes, that figure of $2,500 profit per year per worker is a good measure of the education industry. There are for-profit companies managing $4,000 a worker and others managing $500 a worker, but that's far less than the $6,000 per person in retail or the $9,000 per person in the corporate sector. Where would that $2,500 per person per year go in a not-for-profit higher ed environment? It's certainly not dispersed as profit, so it's either retained as capital or spent on something, perhaps faculty wages, not really. Is $2,500 per employee even the right number? Let's find out. So exploring the productivity of not-for-profit higher ed, using the figures for employees and expenditures compiled by the NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, We can use Walmart as a barometer, the most aggressive squeezer of employee value of our time, but with a more or less average retail profit of $6,000 per employee. This is Jason Furman, Obama's economic advisor, says, you can't criticize Walmart. They're only taking in $6,000 per employee. That's average. But these not-for-profit numbers are huge. Endowment and construction, that's revenue retained as finance capital and fixed capital. That capital accumulation alone amounts to $12,500 per worker. We're not only beating Walmart, we're scorching the corporate sector. We spend another $18,000 per worker on research and public service, plus another $20,000 on hospitals and other enterprises, some of them venture capital enterprises. That's an incredible productivity in the nonprofit education sector, almost $50,000 per worker per year, 5 times, better than 5 times, the productivity of the corporate sector. So no wonder every for-profit manager is trying to figure out the secrets of academic management. Of course, we understand where some of that largesse comes from. The trick to all of this productivity comes partly from faculty teaching for love, and similar wage discounting by administrators and staff. It comes especially from part-time and non-tenure track teaching and graduate students, like many of you here, who are now close to 80% of the faculty. It also comes from undergraduate students, both directly working for cheap wages on campus and being farmed out to other employers. Students' contribution to value in the campus economic complex includes a vast array of enterprises, from local contractors, restaurants, and nursing homes to national media corporations and global banks. Among the most troubling patterns in the economy is the steady conversion of full-time adult positions to part-time low-wage work, including under the rubric of financial aid. This happens in every industry, including from agriculture to pastoral care. Several state and federal laws permit students and young people to be paid less than the minimum wage, as low as $4.25 an hour. At many U.S. institutions, the student workforce includes carpenters, drivers, guards, childcare workers, janitors, gardeners, art restorers, tech support, tutors, medics, graders, cooks, and dishwashers. Employers large and small cluster near college campuses in order to take advantage of this vast, low-wage, transient workforce represented by students. The question of student debt has penetrated public awareness, but student labor is less well understood. Some might feel this is changing with recent high-profile stories about exploitative internships, student athletes considering unionization, and the breathless attention paid to studies suggesting that the fraction of U.S. exotic dancers paying college tuition ranges from 1/3 to 1/2. Though to be fair, this phenomenon is likely non-trivial. One UK study found that 6% of female British students work in the sex trades and calculated that the average large campus there collected between 1 and 5 million generated from sex work. On the other hand, the moralistic and voyeuristic gaze upon athletes and dancers really pulls focus away from the majority experience. That experience is a lot more like that of the hundreds of international guest workers hired by Hershey, many of whom paid $3,000 or more to a labor contractor in order to get an $8.25 an hour warehouse job in central Pennsylvania under the rubric of a J-1 visa for cultural enrichment. As I somewhat cynically wrote at the time, the Hershey employees and others duped into paying to work by way of J-1 visas do get a cultural exchange and an education, just not the one they expected. They learned what it is like to be an American in the bottom quartile, or among the majority of American college students who can't persist to a degree through the maze of debt, overwork, and underpayment that we bizarrely consider normal, the normal lot of a student. Nationally, 80% of undergraduates work while in school for an average of 30 hours a week. Most credible studies agree that working much more than 15 hours negatively affects learning, persistence to degree, and time to degree. Students who overwork miss out on extracurricular life and are overrepresented in the ranks of dropouts, the hyper-indebted, and disaffected. At any one time, over 14 million undergraduates are in the U.S. workforce, a figure larger than the official count of the unemployed, right now around 9 million, with another 2 million discouraged or otherwise marginally in the workforce. It's hard to imagine a federal jobs program that would not involve moving a significant fraction of this work out of student lives and back into adult employment. And I say a fraction because many of the students working are working in permanent jobs. And that figure is just for the paid work. It excludes the tens of millions of unpaid and donated hours or extorted hours that students devote every year to nonprofits and business employers alike in service learning, internship programs, and civic engagement. Of course, this astonishing productivity by students in actual work, both paid and donated, is just the tip of the value iceberg. Today, largely as a result of feminist activism and research, the activities that we understand as labor have expanded enormously since the 1970s, pointing out that the creation, training, and care of traditionally male wage workers depends all over the globe on the often unwaged, traditionally female labor of reproduction. Selma James and Maria Rosa Dalla Costa simultaneously led an innovative Wages for Housework campaign and radicalized our understanding of the labor process. In its narrowest usage, reproductive labor refers to the generally unwaged activities of child-rearing by parents and other caregivers in the family and community. But James and Dalla Costa usefully expanded the insight that capitalism's visibly waged activities depends upon an elaborate supporting network of unwaged effort. This altered a long-standing agreement between Marx and other 19th century analysts with Adam Smith that economic analysis of capitalism should focus on labor that led directly to the employer's profit, such as factory work. For both mainstream and dissenting observers of capitalist production, this agreement created a long-standing series of fundamental blind spots regarding unwaged labor, as in child-rearing and housework, donated labor, as in volunteerism or internship, waged labor in the nonprofit sector, such as teaching, policing, and civil service, free, creative, or intellectual work, subsistence labor in small agriculture, forms of forced labor, such as slavery, indenture, and prison labor, labor in illegal or unregulated circumstances, as in sweatshops, sex work, and the like, working off the books and otherwise legal activities, such as babysitting and off-licensed taxi driving or food service. Underscoring all of the teaching, feeding, nursing, transportation, clothing, and training involved in producing an industrial worker, feminist analysis shifted our gaze from the labor process on the factory floor to the broader network of activities that make the factory possible. From the point of view of many feminists and analysts in the Italian autonomous tradition, such as Paola Verno and Tiziana Terranova, the value represented by consumer goods is produced in a social factory, even as Nick Dyer Witherford has it, a factory planet. A vast, even global web of effort that intersects at the point of assembly, but is not limited to it. As should be obvious from the partial list I gave you, the labor performed in the blind spots of both neoclassical and traditional Marxist economic analysis is actually far greater than the labor performed within it. The persons who contribute much of this unaccounted for labor include women, students and teachers, migrants, guest workers and the undocumented, workers in the service economy, clergy, and civil servants. Many of them are directed into their economic position in relation to their race or ethnicity. Others are seduced into donating or discounting their labor by canny management that portrays the discount as a fair exchange for workplaces that are perceived as fun, creative, or satisfying, as Andrew Ross has documented more than once. Persons in all of these intensely but less visibly laboring groups played a leading role in the worldwide revolutionary ferment of the 1960s. While they often intersected with each other in both planned and spontaneous ways, the new social movements were largely independent or autonomous of traditional sources of power to shape the course of the state, such as political parties and the dominant trade unions. The school of thought that came to be known as autonomism, therefore, emphasizes their power independent of organized political powers, parties and trade unions, and the intersection of workers' interests across economic sectors and national borders. The crucial understanding is that contemporary capitalism captures profit from many activities not generally understood as labor. These include pursuits more typically associated with consumption, leisure, education, community service, and socializing. It's important to grasp that this is not a theoretical or abstract observation by academics. Many kinds of successful businesses directly monetize recreational or self-expressive social activity, as in the social sourcing of revenue-producing content on YouTube, HuffPost, and other media sharing sites. Even your private email is monetized with targeted advertisements. For contemporary capitalism, tapping the labor power of social media goes beyond donating media content. Users also make a second, less obvious gift of countless related activities, the labor of rating content, publicizing it by passing links along, and surrounding the content with entertaining commentary. This phenomenon was notably described by Lazzarato as immaterial labor, a kind of labor previously reserved for privileged or professional tastemakers, such as professors, critics, public relations, advertising workers, and journalists. This pervasive harvest of value by way of ordinary activities in everyday life shapes the way we understand ourselves and manage our futures, updating even such recent histories of late capitalist subjectivity as Randy Martin's Financialization of the Self. At universities with a reputation for athletic excellence, for example, the extracurricular accomplishments and sacrifices of student athletes are readily understood as contributions to the campus brand, while journalistic accounts focusing on the football unionization discourse focus on direct revenue. More thoughtful analysts agree that the prestige capital is more significant than any direct revenue generated by athletics. In fact, most athletics programs operate at a loss, but are viewed by some administrations and development offices as a cheap-at-the-price investment in the school's intangibles, such as reputation and brand recognition, which in turn can be monetized in a variety of ways, such as merchandise sales, or capitalized in buildings or endowments. However, athletics are just one classical form of the ways that students donate to the campus brand. School newspapers are another. So are singing groups, dance troupes, and theatrical productions. Indeed, all of the myriad student extracurricular activities make a contribution, from sororities and religious organizations to student government. Any participation builds the brand. From this perspective, even organizations protesting administrative decisions can add to the campus's appeal. They say to alumni and prospective students, free speech and free spirit survive here. Students participate in the labor and culture of administration by completing evaluation forms, exchanging notes and opinions regarding faculty, maintaining files of term papers, and so forth. Students donate to campus prestige capital with their postgraduate achievements. They likewise contribute value with accomplishments before they even arrive in the form of their test scores, high school rank, arts prizes, and athletic victories. They even contribute value by applying and getting rejected. Blogging and Facebook time adds value. At certain kinds of school, value to the brand is added by the time spent by students in gyms and tanning salons, photographing each other at parties, publishing and circulating those photos. Party schools' reputational capital is generally earned. They don't get their reputations, which, make no mistake, have value in their own way, without the dedicated effort of tens of thousands of students over time. Even at non-partying schools, the importance of the healthy, leisured, yet studious image of students is so important that where such imagery is not generated spontaneously by student life, it has to be manufactured for marketing purposes. Which one of these photos is Kaplan Online? Which one is KSU? When you think about the value created in MOOCs, and actually I think I cut this section, and this is fairly self-explanatory. And I think I also cut this section. The key observation here is who is using the buildings that we're spending so much money on, whether it's the business community or sports arenas. When I was at the University of Louisville, it wasn't students at the basketball games or the football games. Students had a very small number of those tickets. They couldn't afford them if they wanted them. Who benefited from that sports spectacle? When you think about the value created in MOOCs, there are certainly plenty of candidates for value creation. The faculty lecturers write and perform. Producers and instructional technologists also compose. There is the all-important contribution of the intellectual commons, the researchers and writers who collectively produced the knowledge and wrote the texts read in the class, and informing the lectures and course activities. There are the camera and sound people, editors, assistants, and the inevitable interns. There are the hundreds of people involved in creating and coding the different candidates for course authoring software. But in the end, nearly all of this labor, investment, and value is sunk in the course's first iteration. What produces the value in the rerun? To my mind, it's the participants, and the greater and more meaningful the participation, the greater the value. At the minimum, there's the basic study assistance, tutoring, mentoring, and outright instruction that other students provide for free in discussion forums for the courses. There's also their role in grading, commonly through UCLA's proprietary calibrated peer review, or CPR, or a close variation on that project in which students are tutored in grading the work of other students according to a rubric. CPR, as well as all other forms of students teaching students, are not new to MOOCs or developed for them. There are undergraduate graders, tutors, and academic coaches on many campuses, nearly all of them. Some of them volunteers, others paid and seeking unionization. Two groups of RAs and two groups of TAs have unionized at UMass Amherst, and I think UCSD is the other one. While peer grading is one of the largest sources of complaint among MOOC participants, it's possible that given the high percentage of MOOC completers who already have bachelor's degrees and more, who have high related competencies in the subject and are chiefly interested in continuing education or professional development, the peer-to-peer teaching model may work as well in MOOCs as it can work anywhere. And of course, the instructional mode is just one element of peer contact. Many MOOC instructors point to students whose lives are enriched in a variety of ways by the digitally mediated but authentically sociable component of that learning experience. And at least ideally in CMOOCs or connectivist MOOCs, students are encouraged to become active, collaborative knowledge producers, not just knowledge consumers, in ways that are compatible with pedagogies of situated cognition, critical pedagogy, and other efforts to help students think and act like practitioners. CMOOC ideals of aggregation, remixing, repurposing, and social engagement are as creative as they are connective. One way of going on from here would be to compare XMOOCs to CMOOCs, XMOOCs being MIT-X or Harvard-X, which basically download information to CMOOCs, the connectivist MOOCs, and lionize the connectivist ideals while demonizing the XMOOCs as zombie courses that don't realize just how dead they are. My own version of that conversation is blots versus maps, which is to say certain MOOCs, sometimes those described as XMOOCs, largely scale up the worst features of existing pedagogies, that is, big lectures and online tests, BLOTs or blots, while better MOOCs, sometimes those billed as CMOOCs, attempt to create mediated authentic participation in the work of the field being studied, that's MAP or MAPS, to the cognition of professionals in it. However, I think that path is too simplistic. XMOOC providers are trying to move as rapidly as possible to incorporate connectivist opportunities, and many CMOOCs don't live up to their ideals. So in my view, the contrast is not so stark in practice as in theory. What some people describe as the platformed sociality of courseware is not in and of itself enough to create a participatory culture in a scene of teaching and learning at any scale. Participation that isn't meaningfully engaging the discourse and open questions of the field is inauthentic. I think it is more useful to historicize in the remaining time, focusing on one of the earliest industrial era efforts to forge a peer-to-peer pedagogy at scale, the Lancastrian monitorial system. Developed primarily by Joseph Lancaster, a freelance Quaker schoolmaster who began teaching at a penny a lesson per student, the system known as mutual instruction was explicitly designed to leverage adult instruction by a system of student teaching assistants who would lead discussion sections. In the early 19th century, the method was widely adopted in rural or one-house schoolrooms as well as in large urban institutions, sometimes on a grand scale, though never perhaps on the ratio of 500 students to one adult envisioned by Lancaster. Whatever the size of the schoolroom, the essence of instruction was very small breakout sections, discussion forums of fewer than 10 students gathered around one of several media stations, textbooks, prints, chalkboards, and maps led by another student. Like today's MOOCs, students earned badges and certificates and engaged in creative remixing of classical and literary materials in writing orations, dialogues, and plays, often addressing contemporary events. Perhaps as a result of the need to rely on the initiative of the older students, monitorial schools in practice didn't always adhere to the syllabus, and some of the freer interpretations of the monitorial system led to statutes being passed against too much creativity in the schools. In one Massachusetts town, school teachers were barred from spending more than 3 weeks of a 10-week quarter in planning the school theatricals, a multi-hour event that would shut down nearby villages while cousins and craftsmen traveled to spend an afternoon at the show. As an industrial pedagogy, the monitorial system gave way globally to the more centralized and bureaucratic standardization preferred by Horace Mann. Instead of classing by ability and interest in a shared learning studio, working at an individualized learning pace, the modern schoolroom, still drearily familiar to us, separated students by grade and moved them through in lockstep, accompanied by city, state, or even national curricula. They featured our old friends, the teacher lecture, student note-taking, a standard course text, final examinations, and the like. The notion of students as knowledge producers, as playwrights, philosophers, practicing debaters, and composers of history survived, but moved steadily toward the extra curriculum, which continued to flourish until the turn of the century when the massification of culture and the necessary addition of sports and physical culture began to compete for extracurricular space. During the 1830s and 40s, however, even as mutual instruction moved out of the schools, it moved into the culture more broadly. Newly forming radical reform and revolutionary groups engaged in mutual instruction societies, designed their own badges, gave themselves diplomas in communist and labor studies, printed up their own handcrafted rituals and initiation ceremonies, composed songs, speeches, and pageants for communicating with larger publics, and the like. As the schools industrialized, working people and activists created a rich pedagogical culture outside of them. In organizing some of the first militant labor unions in the country, women mill workers, many of them who had been poorly paid school teachers, produced a countercultural, radical, mutual education literature of dissent, provocation, and solidarity. So in their turn did the Knights of Labor, the Wobblies, the John Reed Clubs, and the CIO, along with temperance advocates, abolitionists, and utopians of all stripes. If, as David Montgomery put it, by the early 20th century, modern America had been created over its workers' protests, those protests were created in a non-school culture of mutual instruction. In all the hype surrounding massive courses, they will save us, they will destroy us, we have forgotten that the essential question for MOOCs is not to be or not to be, but rather how to be. My hope is that the dissemination of the monitorial system into the radical culture of the 1840s and beyond has something to tell us about a liberatory future for the technology and the democratic dreams underlying the MOOC and its rhetorics. Looking at MOOCs in the light of the radical history of mutual instruction raises the question of when and why should students be teaching. Embedded in every act of learning is learning the logic of teaching, the hidden curriculum of the pedagogy, the terms and limits of the situation. If I have a faith, it is that biopower tends toward its own liberation. And a liberatory, democratic, mutual instruction will have to be authored horizontally in a medium with potentially massive reach for purposes defined collectively, not from above. Underlying the online courses are dozens of versions of course authoring software currently in use in most large corporations and many universities, though not necessarily most commonly by faculty. Using this software, tens of thousands of persons without PhDs are developing literacies of interactive, creative pedagogy. Certainly the bulk of it is presently under corporate direction, but it is possible to imagine alternatives. And among today's dissidents, radicals, and reformers, these alternatives are being explored in Spocks and docs like that of Liz Losh's FemTechNet. But let's take my favorite dictum from Liz Losh's new book, The War Against Learning, that students and teachers must use the same tools. It's a simple principle, and by it, Liz means to point out that the goal of most pedagogies, helping students to actively participate in the work of a field, is frustrated by the tendency to give projectors and microphones to faculty and clickers and machine-graded tests to students. But if we imagine further with Eric von Hippel that courseware is one particularly vibrant form of a user innovation toolkit, and beyond that, that it isn't people with doctorates grasping this tool for mutual instruction, and further that it isn't a course they want to reauthor, but society itself, we can ask, what radical pedagogy awaits this next generation of tool users? Why not ask, what sort of MOOC will the Zapatistas author? Looking at the intense, and I'm closing, looking at the intense value-adding productivity of student time, even the time not spent obviously working, raises some interesting questions about how we manage the undeniably massive resources of modern American higher education. Are we fairly attending to the needs of undergraduate students when we allocate resources via models that overemphasize certain kinds of easily measured revenue productivity, such as grants in certain disciplines or professional school tuition? Perhaps when we starve the humanities, writing, and classics, we are cheating the students who have given us the gifts of theatrical production, of maintaining the fencing club, and of tying the institution to the community by building websites and making documentaries. Understanding students as productive, both as campus employees and as enmeshed in a global gift economy, also raises questions about the dominant quality models of students, primarily as consumers or revenue sources. The justification for the student as consumer approach to quality management is, broadly speaking, a variant on the old saw that the customer is king and the richer the kinglier. And there are certainly many, many ways in which this philosophy has benefited students and increased student power. But at too many institutions, it has too often increased the power of students according to their spending power, giving full-pay students admissions benefits and better food, better accommodations, and so forth. In some ways, the quality management of students as consumer, that is classed in revenue bands, just like airplanes, first class, economy comfort, economy, and economy next to the toilet, has returned many institutions of higher education to the 19th century, in which the scholarship students shine the shoes of the full-paying leisure class. By understanding that students are producers as well as consumers, we are asking for better accounting of the gifts of time and talent made by so many. If we more completely honored students' full productivity, perhaps we do a better job of honoring other campus producers as well, and more effectively raise questions about the rationale for outsourcing and permatemping. Taking student productivity seriously isn't just a moral standpoint, it's a practical economic question. With students in the workforce working too much to succeed at their studies and outnumbering the official account of the unemployed, it's clear that a program to reduce student overwork by recreating full-time jobs for adults would radically improve many institutions' relationship with their communities. Taking student productivity seriously might also mean looking at classwork as labor time. We might ask tough questions about the billions of hours annually burned on writing papers designed to be read only by one person. How could that writing time be made more socially productive? What if we asked that more student writing be made to circulate in the world? Recognizing the full scope of students' contributions to the campus and world that we do have is one key to collaborating with them to build the campus and world we'd like to have. Regarding MOOCs in particular, this might imply that instead of patting ourselves on the back for vending something that in many cases is neither free nor education, we need to recognize that all of the participants are paying for the course, indeed acknowledging their role in value creation, their teaching, grading, mentoring, coaching, tutoring, and sociability, their contributions to course design and redesign. Might mean that instead of collecting revenue from participants, we should be dispersing it to them. Taking students out of the workforce by giving them a wage simply to study just might unleash an authentically revolutionary wave of creativity. Thank you. Questions?
We would be glad to answer questions, and please come down to the microphone so that everyone can hear you. Thank you.
What's your opinion of?
I think they want you to come to the mic, even though I can hear you.
I got a loud voice. Oh, it's like I'm on line.
You need to be on TV here.
It's your 15 minutes of fame.
What's your opinion of community colleges in general, and as a resource of a more affordable, at least first 2 years of education? And would you just speak to that?
Well, community colleges are tremendously variable, as I think you know, and different parts of the country put vastly different resource envelopes to work on community college efforts. So California is tremendously different from New York or Virginia in that way. The opportunities represented by community colleges likewise vary. Many community colleges are very much focused on workforce preparation. Other community colleges or other aspects of the same community colleges are focused on transfer or the opportunity for transfer. Personally, I think the biggest challenge facing community colleges is the for-profit industry. And what will happen with the for-profit industry is very much up in the air right now. I mean, if you watch the stocks of the for-profits, as I have, they've been on a steep downward trend since the Harkin reports, but they're rebounding nicely since Obama's announcement of a couple days ago that they're backing off on regulation. So I think the biggest question is how do people get sold on the ridiculous investment in a for-profit rather than the wise investment in a community college? Did that answer your question or get anywhere where you were going? Yeah.
I'd like to come back to the last point you were making when you were talking about the potential value of recognizing student labor in the classroom and to compensate students for that. It seems whenever an idea like that is floated in the public sphere, there is always a tremendous objection to it, often from educators saying that it leads to the wrong motivation, it works against students' love for learning, it's the wrong way to go. How would you answer those kind of objections if you wanted to promote the idea that students indeed should get compensation for education?
Right. Well, I mean, there's plenty of precedent. I mean, if you want to have a rational conversation about it, there are plenty of precedent for societies that make the choice to provide a stipend to students for study. They think it's ridiculous to put students to work while they're supposed to be devoting time to study, and they take it as a norm that someone who's studying also has other needs, whether those needs are childcare or recreation. Ultimately, making a proposition like wages for study is something that would have to be embedded in rethinking our broader understanding of what human needs are in this country. It is a long walk.
Do you have any advice or recommendations of some of the first steps students can take to take back their agency in their education?
Yeah. I mean, the first point is deciding to do it, isn't it? And the second point is realizing that few of us have agency as individuals. And once you realize that collectively you have tremendous power, then the only real challenge is building that collectivity. We're tremendously successful at cooperation. It's just a question of choosing to lead that cooperation ourselves from below rather than take direction from above.
Can you provide any examples of students who have come together and built community to make change?
Sure. I mean, most people don't grasp that Occupy, for instance, begins with campus occupations, largely by grad students. Graduate student campus occupations and some of the people within them played a very important role in creating and inspiring the Occupy movement. There are examples of undergraduates and graduates not just occupying their campuses, but transforming them, often through formal organizations like unions, but just as frequently through informal and spontaneous organizations, taking advantage of opportunities or manufacturing the necessary affect. And by manufacture, I just simply mean by intentionally working together to create a culture in much the same way that management creates culture by intention. I mean, corporate cultures, academic corporate cultures, are cultures of intention. They're actively created by highly paid individuals within the corporation to develop, a culture of gift giving that aims the gift at the corporation. One of the things we might do is to create a culture of gift giving that aims our desire that most of us have, 90% of us. 90% of us are not sociopathic. 90% of us want to give and don't want to further our own interests. 90% of us are irrational that way and pointing that unreason toward a better goal than someone else's accumulation is a worthwhile task. I can't tell if somebody's leaving or coming down. Leaving. And I don't blame you. I'm sorry I drew attention to you.
Over in Chicago at the University of Illinois, there was some alignment between faculty and adjunct and instructors to fight for a living wage for people who are kind of occupying more of those service positions. Do you see opportunities for both undergraduate, graduate students, and people who kind of fulfill this middle role, and faculty to kind of align to recreate the universities to serve more of the purpose that you're seeing, or do you see their roles in kind of conflict?
That is a very important question, and so I would like to answer it as honestly as possible. And my honest answer is probably not the most cheering answer. That is, I think if faculty were going to fix these issues, they would have done it 25, 30 years ago. My sincere belief is that faculty are not the agents on the scene. Despite the incredible dedication of individual faculty, I think the faculty as a mass are not the agents. I think ultimately students, undergraduate students, even more than grad students, undergraduate students are the only imaginable agents of change. And as in the past, faculty will be pulled along by their undergraduate students, and the example of things like school teachers and civil servants who organized and transformed their workplaces long before the faculty bestirred themselves and imitated them. And I suspect that now that the faculty are down to 20% of the total, that is even more likely to be the case. So I think that the change that does come will come below the level of the faculty, and that the faculty will tag along and take credit for it towards the end. And I don't mean that to sound mean. I spend a lot of time with faculty. I think faculty make big differences and make important choices. But I don't think that even if the faculty organize themselves, and by the faculty I mean the track faculty in this case, that they could make change. I think it is the contingent workforce, whether you're talking about the students or whether you're talking about graduate students or whether you're talking about non-track faculty, that will make change. I could say something else depressing if you like.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Feel free to visit with Mark in the back as he's doing a book signing, and look forward to seeing you at future Lou Douglas lectures. Thank you so much.
Thank you.